Hey everybody, welcome back. I want to talk to you today about OpenTrack. It's a software that we can use to set up our Tobii eye trackers in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. If you are familiar with this problem right now, if you go into the settings and click on controls and click here on your Tobii and then click on hardware settings, you get a crash to desktop. So unfortunately we have to deal with a workaround right now. So I'll show you what it looks like real quick once we get it set up. If we get here in the cockpit and I enable the head tracking, as you can see, works really nicely. Let's look at how we set this up with OpenTrack. There's some confusion as to what the best settings are, and I'll go through things for you here right now. So OpenTrack is on GitHub. You come here to GitHub. I'll put a link in the description. Click here, come down, and then click on this executable right here, the win32 setup.exe file, and then just save it to your PC. All you have to do is run the executable file and it will install the software on your PC. I would recommend creating a desktop shortcut because I have mine saved here to my taskbar because you have to start this software every time you want to use it in the sim. So there is a software from Tobii called Tobii Game Hub that you can use to work with OpenTrack, but I actually just use OpenTrack by itself. So once you set up the software and open it, this is what you'll see. And the first thing you want to do, a lot of people are going to tell you to select UDP over network, but for Tobii, if you have a Tobii eye tracker, what you want to select is Tobii eye tracker. Big shocker, I know. The output you want is FreeTrack 2.0 Enhanced, and the filter you want is Acela. Now, one of the things that you can do is set different profiles. If you want to create a profile where you can configure it from scratch, select Create New Empty Config, or what you can do is simply open the program, go through the setup, which doesn't take very long, and then once you have it set up, at least an initial setup, it might not be your final setup, but once you have a setup, click here on Create New Copied Config, and then just, enter MSFS or MSFS 2024, whatever you want, and then it'll save that profile. So you can save different profiles for different games. But what I've done initially is just create new empty config, and then I called it Tobii 1. So the first thing we're going to look at is the options. First of all, this is a preview right here on the right hand side. There is no video because I'm not using a camera, so we're not going to see anything there on the left. But you can see here on the right, as I move my head, you'll probably hear some volume changes in the microphone. Is that when you move around, the little octopus over here moves around as well, and that shows you what's happening as you move your head around. So click here on options. The first thing you want to do, there are two things that you want set to either keyboard shortcuts or a key bind if you have, let's say, a Honeycomb Alpha. If you click here on bind, what this does is center the view, because one of the things that happens if you move around physically, sometimes when you come back to your physical center position where you're normally sitting, even if that position is just slightly off from where you were sitting before, it's going to be off by quite a bit in the sim. So what you want to have is a center button. So click bind here, and you can do one of two things. You can use a keyboard command, let's say J, or what is a whole lot better is using a button on your yoke. So what I personally do, on the right side of the Honeycomb Alpha, there is a red button and a white button on the yoke, and I simply use the white button on the right side. It's joystick button 2. I put that for center. And then toggle means turn it on and off, basically turn head tracking on and off. With OpenTrack, you can actually look at something like zoom. If you wanted to zoom in on, let's say, a checklist or an instrument or whatever, and then hold your view right there, pause your view at what you're looking at, you can do that. And that's with toggle right here. And what toggle does is simply turns on or off the head tracking. So if you click bind, and what I use is on the left side of the Tobii, on the left side of the Honeycomb Alpha, on the front of the yoke handle, there is a button, and I just press that button. It's joystick button 0. So that's all I set up, is a center and a toggle. And if we come over here and I move over this way and I press the button, it's going to center me. and let's say I sit back to my normal position and I'm slightly off center, I just hit that button again and it brings me back to center. Now let's say I want to look at, let's say, another monitor for charts or whatever, and I hit the toggle button. I can now move my head around all I want. You can see the raw tracker data there on the left is going bananas as I move my head around, but nothing is happening to the octopus because I've got it toggled off. Toggle it back on, I start looking around again. So if we come back here into options, game detection unfortunately doesn't work for Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is why you need the desktop shortcut that I mentioned earlier. And then here is the filter. Now the filter is quite useful. The smoothing makes small movements take effect slower. I have found personally that jacking the smoothing all the way up makes it very, very quite useful. You don't have any delay and it doesn't feel like, I don't know, soupy or unnatural, but it makes the movement in the sim very smooth, which is what you're looking for. And I've actually left the dead zones at the default values, but I turn the smoothing all the way up. Now let's take a look at the mapping. So the mapping is actually what translates your physical head movements to the movements that you see in the sim. You click here on the button. The default settings for yaw is going to be 180 degrees. For pitch, it's going to be 90 and 90. And for roll, it's going to be 90 degrees as well. What yaw is left and right turning of your head. And if you can see, basically the most I can turn my head and still keep my eyes on the screen is at most 45 degrees. You have to remember that as you turn your head, you still have to keep your eyes on the screen. So 45 degrees is about the most you want there. If you click here on pitch, pitch is up and down. That's about the most I can move my head up. And this is about the most I can move my head down. And we're going to use this asymmetrical mapping for pitch, but we'll talk about that in a second. So I would say here, the most you're going to want is, again, 45 degrees. And then roll is as you kind of twist your head, lowering your ear towards your shoulder. It's like the way your dog looks at you when you talk to them. And in this particular case, 30 degrees is more than enough, but I'm going to set it to 45 and I'll explain why shortly. Come back here to yaw. So we've got this 45 degrees of movement of max input in yaw. Now we can set different points along this line. If there is an acceleration here, you can see what we're doing along the bottom here is how much you're physically moving your head. And along the left side here is how much movement you're actually going to see in the sim. So if I move my head to where that dot is all the way out here, I'm actually going to be looking 180 degrees behind me. And let's look real quick here on the octopus. You can see it turns a different color. And that means I am looking behind myself. And the reason you want to be able to do that is because you actually need more ability to kind of see around in the sim than you can physically. You can't physically turn your shoulders around to look behind you in the sim. So we kind of have to recreate that in OpenTrack. The next thing we want to talk about, you want to have less of an acceleration of movement, physical movement to movement in the sim here along the initial part of the scale, and you want more movement towards the end. And the reason is you don't want small head movements to make really big changes when you're pretty much in the center of the view. Whereas if you're trying to look behind you, you want movement at the outside of your physical movement range to translate to more movement in the sim. And so what you want to do, the first thing you want to do, come up here to the corner of this box and you want to left click up here in the corner. And what that does is it sets the endpoint for the linear scale, so this endpoint won't move. And then what we can do is bend this line. So if you come here somewhere between 15 and 20, if you left click right about there, and then come here between 25 and 30, and let's say left click right about here. And what that's going to do, it's going to make movements in the center of your range of motion have less of an impact on the physical movement in the sim, whereas the further you turn your head is going to start to accelerate more, and we'll see that better in the sim once we look in the sim. And for pitch, we want to do the same thing. Come up here, just click. You can even click outside of this rectangle here, and it's going to put this one point up here in the upper right hand corner. And then if we just do kind of like this again, and then if we click on roll, we can do the same thing again. Come up here until you see that plus sign, and then click up here in the upper right. And then about a third of the way out, put a point, and about another third of the way out, you can put a point. You want to move them. If you left click and hold it, you can move these to drag them. If you want to get rid of one of these points, if you want to delete it, just right click it and it goes away. But otherwise, just hold your mouse wherever you want to put that point, left click, and it's going to put in that point for you. For X, Y, and Z, I haven't done anything. I find these to be pretty good. One thing I would not recommend doing that I do see some people do is using this here to put in a dead zone. You can put a point here and drag it down to the bottom and say create about a 3-degree dead zone, 2-degree dead zone, whatever you want. The problem is you can see the way the point flattens out right here and then bounces off. If you do a dead zone this way, you're going to have a big pause, and the movement of your head in the sim is literally going to be like kind of like a pendulum, and it's just very unnatural. Now for pitch, you do want some what's called asymmetrical mapping, and the reason is because when you can actually look up quite a bit further than you can look down, really. I mean, I can look up quite comfortably 40 degrees and still see the screen. I can't look down 40 degrees and see the screen. So if you click on asymmetrical mapping, you can see here at the top is the mapping for looking up, and at the bottom is the mapping for looking down. So what I would do here on the looking down, about 30 degrees is about as much as I want. And so I would come here and create a point, and then just drag that point to about the 30-degree mark here at the top. And then again, create my little create my little curve here, and then click OK. All right, here we are back in the sim. And you can see I've got really smooth movement. I can look around quite nicely. And if I want to, turn around pretty easily. With the curves that we've set, I can turn just a little bit, and it's pretty natural in terms of how much the turning of my head affects the turning in the sim until I get to about this point, and then from here on, just a slight movement of the head gives me a view towards the back. Again, looking up is a lot easier than looking down, so I've got the acceleration set for looking down, and the roll feels pretty natural. You don't use that a whole lot in the sim. So I feel like OpenTrack really does a pretty good job of setting this up. And I'm going to show you my mappings now. This is what I came up with at the end of the whole process for me. You can use this as kind of a baseline for making your own adjustments. Roll, I've got it at 45 degrees. I've got the one dot here at 13.5. I've got another dot here at 25 by 72. And then I have the top here set at 35. For pitch, I've got one set at 11 by 18. I've got one set at 20 by 45. And then I have one at 25.5. And that's for looking up. And then for looking down, I didn't really feel like the curve made as much of a difference looking down as it does looking up. So what I've got is I've got it set right here at 90 at the top. And then for roll, again, 45 degrees. I've got one point here at 13 by 37. I've got another point here at 23.5 by 84. And then I've got my final dot up here at 30. And if we come here to my options, come over here to filter, as you can see, I've got smoothing maxed all the way out on rotation. This is yaw, pitch, and roll. And then position filtering XYZ, I've got it all the way maxed out as well. The dead zones are standard settings, 0.3 degrees here and 0.1 millimeters here. And the last couple things I'll show you, some people say that you should invert the x-axis. I did not find that I needed to do that. What the x-axis is sliding left and right, basically. I found that when I invert the x-axis, when you slide to the left, you move to the right in the sim and vice versa. The other thing you do want, click here on relative translation, and you want to enable relative translation. What relative translation does, if you turn your head all the way around so that you're viewing backwards in the sim and then move towards your screen, because you've got your head rotated in the sim, it's actually going to move backwards from what you're viewing rather than towards it. So if we come back here into the sim, so if I look backwards and now I move towards the screen, because I'm looking backwards, it's going to actually move away from what I'm looking at in the sim. And again, as I'm looking backwards, if I move away physically, it's going to actually move towards what I'm looking at. So if we come back here to the settings, come into options, relative translation, and enable that, now what happens if we turn around and we move forward physically, it's going to move forward in the sim. If we move backwards, it's going to move backwards in the sim. So now we've got this set up in the sim. It's not perfect. I might make some adjustments as I go, but this is a pretty good basic setup. I do find that the native Tobii software, the one that we use in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, is a bit smoother than OpenTrack, but it's not that much different. The other thing that I really find pretty cool with OpenTrack is you can zoom in on something and toggle tracking off and keep your view there, which you can't do with the native Tobii software. So I think this is a pretty cool workaround. At least I may wind up staying with it depending on what the implementation of the Tobii software is in the sim. But at least for right now, those of you with the Tobii eye tracker can use it again. And hopefully Microsoft will address this soon. Asobo will address this soon. So for now, we're going to say goodbye from Beef Island, Tortola in the British Virgin Islands. I hope you guys are having a great day, and we'll talk soon.